This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Well, good evening. My name is Josanne Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the famous Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Now, I normally start off with mentioning your political ambitions, but I will just let it go tonight. But with the country awaits a decision, I'll let it go with that.
My political ambitions are less and less with each passing day.
Okay, well, good. We've been through that. Well, we can have a discussion. We mentioned different kinds of words that are of consequence, and we just sort of, as you might say, unbundle them and talk about them a little bit. But one word would be freedom. Now, obviously, that word freedom is just part of it. It's a cultural icon. It's out there. It's everywhere. That's part of the American identity. We're a free country. Other countries are not free. The great glory of our country is we have freedom. It's in songs. It's on television. It's the one word that you could say basically encapsulates American identity. The way that in other countries, I might pick China, a word like harmony sort of captures their cultural nuance. Well, having made that introduction, do you think this is a free country? I'll start with that question.
Why would you think this is a free country? I'll just hit it right back to you.
Well, because people imagine that it is.
Yes.
And then we go, well, all right, but since you're a little reluctant to swing at that pitch, let me ask that question, does free will exist? Shall we?
Oh, my goodness, that's an entirely different.
Well, but if you believe in freedom, you have to imagine that free will is the other shoe there. So if you don't have free will, I'll ask that question.
Yes.
If you don't have free will, can freedom exist?
Well, you are the neuroscientist. So, and I have been a little bit slack keeping up with this area of science. But the latest that I heard was when they're doing EEGs and they ask somebody to make a decision. Apparently, the EEG shows some sort of decision being made before the person becomes conscious of having made it, which indicates that the idea that you are freely making a decision is simply illusory. Do you know anything about this research?
Well, I don't know exactly in regards to that, but obviously we've blundered into a very theologically complicated story connected with human identity. And I think we could say that we have these influences that exist. But if the brain can sail the ship into rationality, if we can get to that point, sort of in regards to mathematics, we get to that point, we could say that our cognitive facilities could weigh different arrangements, and then they would make a choice depending on how their rational nature interprets the evidence. You could at least sail the ship in that direction, and contrary-wise, you could say, well, the environment is impacting all this. So what I'm getting into is there might be a substantial question mark around free will, meaning maybe there's a substantial question mark around the ability for humans to have true freedom. If in fact you say, well, freedom for me means to, go to football games every Friday night, and I can do that, and thus I'm free. But well, you go to football games because you're socially conditioned to do it. So, but letting that argument, maybe we'll just let that argument sit.
Well, I think we could, because I think even assuming arguendo, there is no such thing as free will. I think there can still be a debate on whether or not there is freedom. Let's say that I am in fact an automaton in a deterministic world, and I have no free will. Yet my brain is still going to react to certain stimuli. It's going to behave in certain programmed ways. And if you have a coercive society, it's going to tell my brain, free will or not, that there are certain things it may not do. There are certain decisions
Yes.
that it may not follow up on. So I think that I would say the question of whether or not theologically or neurologically there is free will is irrelevant to the question of whether there is freedom.
Well, we could play tennis on that concept,
Yes.
but let us put our tennis rackets down for a bit.
Sure.
It seems to me that one of the things, if one's considering freedom, is what's the antithesis of freedom, and it would be there'd be lots of things, but you could say, for the purposes of American identity, it would be slavery. So the idea is that you're free if you're not a slave. Is that a definition of freedom? And what actually is a slave is the next question.
Yes, well, it's a possible definition of freedom, but you're kind of punting, I think. So I think the question would be, what is slavery? The type of slavery that we usually think of in the United States would be chattel slavery, which goes to the issue of who owns your labor, and if you want to push a little farther, who owns your body, and you use your body to produce labor. So that could get us into more of a capitalist communist sort of arrangement, if you like, and market capitalism, which is freedom, versus collectivist Marxism, which is the antithesis of freedom. So your resources, the resources that you yourself produce, who has the right to them, you or someone other than you?
Well, I mean, actually, to tell you the truth, so if we accepted that as the argument, and our resources, the social contract requires us to surrender resources to the government for redistribution or whatever. So, and also just taking the idea that your labor is the mark of the access to the fruits of your labor is the mark of freedom, and no one else having any access to that. I think it would be hard to find people that were in that condition. So you would have to, the responsibility of your children, you're going to have to do something for them. The responsibility that you have for your parents, you have to do something for that. You have social responsibilities of all sorts that are, you could say that you obtained these responsibilities it was not your free will that you got them, it just happened. So what I'm getting into is almost everyone has, they have a social contract with society, and their freedom is being impinged upon in many, many ways. And probably the most extreme example would be as a bonded slave.
Yes. That
would be a very extreme circumstance in this relative arrangement. So you would be required to surrender your autonomy to another person's will, who could do with you as he or she wished.
Yes.
So and you could say that doesn't take place in regards to the United States now. Thus, in that restricted definition, you could say, well, this would be free, in that we don't have chattel slavery. It would be unusual for a person to just be able to do with you as they wished, regardless of your welfare.
Well, I would counter that it's a sliding arrangement. You just have made a strong argument for the case that none of us is perfectly free.
That's correct.
So the question is, how much autonomy can you surrender, or can you be expected to surrender and still maintain the label of free? So yes, I have duties to my parents, I have duties to my children, I have duties to this collective that we call the people, in terms of monetary duties. Income tax time is coming in a few months. Public safety duties. I cannot drive faster than 70 miles an hour legally on I-75 going to Atlanta. Exactly how much control can someone else or everyone else in the aggregate have over me while I am still legitimately able to say I am free?
So we're getting into, I think, the crust of where we're selling the ship here is the argument that it's a relative term. We have sort of an idea about absolute absence of freedom. And maybe an example, we mentioned slavery, maybe another example would be if you were quadriplegic and you were utterly dependent on other people to do whatever, and you lost the ability to control your environment. I mean, you could say, well, there are levels of people that their physical limitations have imposed substantial restraints on their freedom. You can say financial situations really restrict freedom. So it's a very relative term that goes back and forth. And the question I would ask, saying this is relative, is there some kind of scale in the world about who is, quote, free, if we can agree with the definition of that, and who's not free? Maybe another way to say this is there a scale that exists that would state these are the restrictions this person has on their free will? And it might be age, it might be financial issues, it might be social arrangements, lots of things. And in this arrangement, everyone has, to a greater or lesser degree, restraints. The question to ask is, why do we make such a big deal about the absence of some restraints and not others? And I think it's the national identity, the national story. And one of the biggest definitions of freedom would be some other ethnic group or nationality is controlling our sense of self. And I think the movie Braveheart, just to throw that out, I mean, it was just a scene in the movie when the hero was being tortured,
drawn and quartered, yes.
Which seemed to be very unpleasant. I would suggest it as very unpleasant. And they asked for mercy instead with his last gasp.
Freedom.
He cried freedom, meaning the freedom from the English. You'd still be if you lived in Scotland in 1314 and you were free. Only that meant that you didn't have an English king over you. You had a Scotch king over you. Your life was just as miserable as it's ever been. You had economic difficulties. There were the restraints of getting enough to eat, physical health. You couldn't, go up mountains easily. Your feet hurt. So a very small part of that cry for freedom was just to say, we won't have an English king above us.
Yes, freedom from as opposed to freedom to. I must digress for just a second and explain why I laughed when you mentioned that scene. I had just finished, when I saw Braveheart, I had just finished writing a book on, I believe it was treason, and I was looking at the penalty for treason, and it was drawing and quartering. And
still in the U.S. or
but back in the early days. And I was reading Sir William Blackstone's description of drawing and quartering. And so I was watching this scene and I was ticking off things on a checklist. Yes, they've drawn. Yes, they're quartering him now. And everyone else in the room with me is getting disgusted and getting up and walking out as I'm clinically watching this.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So they did exactly what should have happened?
It was a fairly accurate rendition of drawing and quartering.
It appeared to be extremely unpleasant. Yes.
But yes, it's freedom from versus freedom to. And these are, you can refer to them as negative freedoms or positive freedoms, or negative liberties and positive liberties. And so what does it mean by that? Americans traditionally mean it in the way that William Wallace meant it. The libertarian cry is none of your darn business. So I may not necessarily have the freedom to do anything I want, but at least you are not going to be the one telling me what I get to do and what I don't get to do.
In the national anthem, it's the home of the brave, the land of the free.
Yes.
Does that just really mean that we don't have an English king here? Is that what that means? So when we consider freedom, at least in that regard, it's just there's not any alien entity out there that is controlling the country.
I think so, and I think it really comes down in our history to economics and religion. That if you were a religious dissenter, then you were not only running the risk of being killed, but also being sent to hell if you were being forced into what you believe to be a false religion or a false faith. And then economically, a lack of economic opportunity, either because the market had failed you in England or because the government itself was extorting or somehow limiting your economic freedom. And so what do you do in either one of these circumstances? You come to the New World where there is no government. And let's look at the opposite of this. Freedom also means or entails the freedom to fail. Freedom is a circumstance in which you've got high risk and potentially high return. That if something goes wrong, there is no 911 to call, there are no police to bail you out. You have to solve the problem yourself or not at all. High risk, high return. That's the nature of the frontier.
Yes. Well, we have that concept. Well, the other thing with freedom is we mentioned from and to, but you could think about the four freedoms and the number of times freedom has been internalized in our national identity. It's really part of the American exceptionalism.
Yes.
So I'm remembering the four freedoms, and one of them was freedom from want.
Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of worship, and I believe freedom of speech.
Yes.
So you've got two freedoms to and two freedoms from.
Well, and just looking at, all right, freedom from want. I mean, so is that contrary to your earlier statement of what freedom was? That's kind of paradoxical, isn't it?
Yes.
So you have to truly be free from an existentialist point of view. You have to be able to fall off the mountain. You have to starve to death to truly be free.
Yes.
Freedom from fear. That's the same thing. I mean, firstly, it's irrational to imagine that you can be free from fear. Mm-hmm. Fear, it's actually, you could say, a useful thing. I mean, you want to fear behavior that's going to injure you as a person or injure your family. I don't know if you have no fear of, I don't know, driving down the wrong side of the street or whatever, no fear of, I don't know, embezzling money. So freedom that's an extremely useful thing. So a lot of this is the sort of the propaganda part of it. But at least people imagine they have a lot of freedom that exists. One other point to make about this is the other things were freedom of speech, at least, and then what was our other one there?
And freedom of worship.
Freedom of worship.
And I've got a big problem with that one as well.
All right, well, just to continue, do we believe now that these four freedoms were hatched out in World War II or 60 years ago, 70 years ago? Do we believe that freedom of speech is as much now as earlier, and freedom of worship the same? Because isn't the government progressively, as other issues of consequence balloon up? We made the analogy of the soap bubble, so we have, I don't know, let's say gender equality that's ballooning up, and that's having substantial impact on, you could say, freedom of speech, or if in some ways your speech causes another person to take offense, then you are not able to express yourself.
Yes.
And so is it fair to say the country is, maybe reasonably, is much less free without 350 million people than it was in 1950 with 150 million?
Yes, I think absolutely. That when you have the frontier, there's absence of government, there's small population, the ultimate freedom, and this is why I think American theorists were so taken with the idea of the social contract and the writings of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who imagined this state of nature, because to a degree they were living the state of nature. That if you come to Jamestown, and Jamestown is now getting settled and there are more people there and they're starting to pass more laws and telling you what you can do and what you have to do with your property, and you say, that's it, I'm sick of it. You pull up stakes.
I'm moving to North Carolina.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say South North Carolina. I would say west, 20 miles or 30 miles, yes. And you're beyond the reach of civilization again.
I was making a joke. I mean, people cross the North Carolina line from the dismal swamp.
Yes, of course.
Well, now, having sailed the ship in this direction, we get into the other issue that say, well, look, the assumption is this is all sort of a white male story. Yes. What about the ladies, if I can use that word, and then what about people of color?
Yes.
I mean, and say, well, things were great in 1950, maybe not. And so one of the huge parts of the country, and this is the evolving American ethos, is the idea that now people that were formerly restricted their choices were impaired by the what do they call it, the patriarchal world.
Yes.
They were, and that was it was like the King of England, mm-hmm. holding back the colonists. And so now the king has been dethroned, and now they can be free. And they would say, now we're freer than we've been because that's the evolution of the country, and now we can claim the idea that we're free. In the whole story with the black civil rights movement, the freedom marches, the whatever march on Washington, freedom, the songs that were the civil rights era that were out there, and a lot of the feminist arrangements there. So, is there a class of people or classes of people that are now becoming freer? And so, in other words, is restrictions to society, some groups are going down and some groups are going up in regards to the normal restraints that have been placed upon them,
yes.
since everyone has restraints.
Yes. Well, we've talked about this some in past episodes, and I think there's just no getting around the fact that equality is the enemy of freedom, and freedom is the enemy of equality. And to show that this is the case, let's go back to that state of nature. If we really are in a Hobbesian state of nature, the war of all against all, I have the freedom to do anything at all that I can get away with by virtue of my brains or my physical strength. And that includes many things that we would consider today to be grossly immoral, racist, sexist, violent, homicidal, anything. And equality is one of the things that puts the limits on that. I cannot treat persons of color as second-class citizens or as non-citizens or as non-humans. I'm simply not allowed to do that. By putting that limitation on me, you do make a greater degree of equality in society, but only by restricting certain freedoms. So when you put it that way, obviously, I think most rational people would say, yes, we do need equality to put some just limits on freedom. The question is, how far can we take that? How far should we take that before it becomes inequitable?
Well, I mean, you get into all. This is a complicated story about, actually the French freedom or equality, liberty,
égalité,
and fraternity, yes. Right. So the idea is, you get into that, there are contradictions that exist. Now, one of the things that happens with equality is you can imagine that there's sort of different, groups of people, and one group has got 10 pounds of burden on them, and 12 and 18 and 19, and so if the burden is being shifted from one group to another, then one group will correspondingly have less freedom, the other group more freedom.
Yes.
So if the rubric here is equality, we're going to have equality, and this person is way down the scale of, not being totally equal to other people. Mm-hmm. So now all these encumbrances are removed, the burden comes off this person and might be transferred to another person, but the initial impact would be for the person on sort of the short end of the stick to have more freedom. So another, I think, concept is out there as we parse the word out, is there are different degrees of freedom that exist in the world, and the system is changing, and a lot of it is force is causing this change, which is a lot of things. Some of it is morality. The idea is, well, maybe the Creator wants everyone's soul is equal, ergo life on the earth should be equal. You have those issues, and then the power is that if you're an aristocrat in 1917 in Petrograd, then you just don't have the power to preserve this inequality.
Yes.
So people demand some kind of more even allocation of society resources, and thus freedom.
Yes. And I think that's really I wouldn't say Marxist-Leninist, but certainly the Marxist view of things is that you essentially make freedom a non-issue by emphasizing the collective so much, that if we could ever achieve this degree of perfect collectivization, then all of our interests are so similar that there will be no conflict. We own everything in common. We will not fight over anything.
Right.
It sounds like a beautiful thing. I just don't think that it's workable in practice. I mean, biologically, each one of us is trying to turn things in the environment into us by consuming it and turning it into energy and mass. And that means you and I may be in conflict for this protein source.
So, I mean, I won't get too much into the whole story, but one of the issues out there is that, I think you've mentioned, is the social contract. So what's going to happen is if the humans get together, they're going to have some kind of arrangements where goods are distributed, often based on merit, that people are going to have at least they'll subscribe to the idea the situation seems fair, which is a hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. And if the situation doesn't seem fair, the society dissolves. And one of the issues out there is the notion of freedom. So it's important to have that notion in the interstices of the national identity, just because the country is so diverse, and we require a national moral foundation to exist. Yes. And the centerpiece of it in many ways is freedom. And if people really thought this is not a free country, whatever that means, it's free in Canada, it's free in Japan, it's free in Cuba, but not free here, it would cause it'd be a terrible event.
It's a radically different model of freedom. It reminds me of a famous line of Malcolm X's, that we, and I think he's referring to African Americans, we did not land on Plymouth Rock landed on us.
That's right. Yes, right. Well, now let me ask this question. You know, we've gone through the word freedom, and there's another word out there, liberty. So if you I've made this comment before, getting macro data, if you picked all the printed words that existed in, 1700, 1800, and you sort of said, well, here are the number of words that meant liberty, and here are the number of words that meant freedom, you discover that 200 years ago, the idea of liberty was a far more popular word, yes. And that freedom has come more to the fore, and it's rare that one really talks about liberty. I mean, if you in any kind of dialogue or discussion, liberty it's an antiquated word which might go back. We discussed honor a little bit.
Yes.
Liberty is a word that goes back to the frontier. Maybe it goes back to the notions that kings aren't there. And it also has a libertas. I think it gets into, if you really sail the ship, into being libertine,
yes.
Or feeling no restraint.
License or licentious.
Right, so it has sort of that flavor to it.
Yes. It's also the root of liberal.
Yes.
Liberalize, to liberate, of course.
Right.
Which, in my view, I don't know how much I'm glossing this, would be the same as freedom from. To escape bondage, to move from a situation of greater control to a situation of less control.
That may be a point of issues. We're talking about freedom to and freedom from.
Yes.
Well, liberty, I guess you're free from the king's will, and you could also presumably have whatever kind of life you wished. So the important notion is balance. And the word is extraordinarily important to us. So if the word was ever diminished, it would really disturb national psyche. Yeah. Less so in other countries. I don't think. As far as I know, in Cuba, the word freedom is maybe not so important. A word like fairness or something would be more important.
Perhaps. And fairness sounds more like equality. So
maybe other countries want fair as opposed to freedom.
Yes.
Although people would say that freedom was a subset of fairness. Mm-hmm. And my last question is, does fairness trump freedom?
It depends on who you ask. In our society, and speaking as a constitutionalist, the word liberty shows up very prominently in the Constitution from almost the beginning, but we've also got in the 14th Amendment dating from 1868 the word equality. How do you square the two?
Yes.
They're both constitutional mandates.
Well, it's been an interesting discussion, I think, in that we've sort of bounced the basketball about words that are commonly used that we need to think more about. Mm-hmm. And on that note, to Bucky, thank you once again for being with us tonight. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.